Hello, my name is Osha. I like to talk about American presidents, and I'm going to be continuing my discussion of Plessy versus Ferguson, the landmark case in 1896, which established separate but equal, and it became the impetus for the jury segregation in the South and the Jim Crow system, what came to be known as the Jim Crow system, which segregated blacks and whites. So that was sort of like an American apartheid system that existed in the South, keeping blacks and whites separate. But it was built on this presumption of uh, that that Americans, that the races, blacks and whites, could be kept separate yet still be recognized as equal as required by the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The United States Constitution required equal protection of the laws. So that's the equality clause. It's saying that, well, no state shall deny any person within its jurisdiction of the equal protection of the laws. Earlier clauses in that 14th Amendment, it state that no that no laws shall be the states shall not make or enforce any laws that will abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. It is established also that persons born in the United States are American citizens. Persons born or naturalized in the United States are American citizens, right? So that established that African Americans were U.S. citizens. So that's the 14th Amendment. So Plessy versus Ferguson had gone to Plessy, that's Homer Plessy, who was an octoroon in Louisiana. He had challenged the Separate Car Act that was passed by the Louisiana legislature. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, by the way, in my earlier video, I'd said the Chief Justice at that time was Billings Brown. It wasn't Billings Brown. Billings Brown wrote he wrote Justice Billings Brown wrote the opinion, the majority opinion, but the Chief Justice was Fuller. He was named Fuller. Um, and so the majority opinion argued that, well, that um, the 14th Amendment did not uh, did could not eliminate distinctions of race, right? That distinctions of race exist, and distinctions of race do not mean that the races were unequal, right? Those were their postulations. However, the great dissenter John Marshall Harlan, um, Justice John Marshall Harlan, whom I said was named after Chief Justice John Marshall. There were several justices that were named after Chief Justice John Marshall. Chief Justice John Marshall was one of our early Chief Justices at the founding. He wasn't the first one. I think it was about the fourth Chief Justice, but he's the longest serving Chief Justice. And so very important landmark decisions that guide us today, right? Including judicial review, which came from Madison versus Marbury, right? The great Madison versus Marbury, which established judicial review. Judicial review is just the power of the U.S. Supreme Court to decide if to review the acts by the executive and the legislature to deem if they're constitutional or unconstitutional, right? So, and that's of course why this case went all the way so this is an instance of judicial review because the Separate Car Act was a legislative act. It was a law by the Louisiana legislature, and Homer Plessy was challenging it. He first challenged it from a New Orleans court. John Howard Ferguson was the judge, and it went all the way to the Louisiana Supreme Court. They sided with Ferguson, said it was constitutional, and then they did a writ, went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the U.S. Supreme Court said it was constitutional, that the segregation law of separate the separate car act in Louisiana was legal, and of course that would be a catalyst to more segregation laws in the South. And what it would end up doing was it would eventually disenfranchise blacks, and all the Reconstruction era legislative acts that had been decided in favor of uh, the civil rights and the equality of the the formerly enslaved black Americans, those would all be stripped. They would be, eviscerated. So remember, I'd mentioned the pendular phenomenon in civil rights experience of black Americans, right? They move forward and then two steps backward. And there's always that blowback by the reactionary racists, or, those who are, against equality for blacks. So let's take a look at what Justice John Marshall Harlan said. He made very significant comments. I'd done an earlier video. This is the second part of Plessy versus Ferguson that I'm discussing. And I want to just quickly remind us of his background, why he dissented heavily. He said he challenged the justices, all right, on the court, because he was the only dissenter. So he's known as the great dissenter. The others were seven justices who agreed that, well, that the the law, the separate car act in Louisiana, the segregationist law, is lawful, right? That established separate but equal. But Justice John Marshall Harlan was challenged them and said they were being um, willfully ignorant. That was what he called them, willfully ignorant. And because he said, look, everyone in America knows that the purpose of segregating the races, right, in accommodations and facilities was because the white majority, the white population in America, white Americans believed they were dominant, that they were superior to black people, right? That's the purpose. They believed that they were superior to black people in wealth, in power, in education, in everything, right? In status. They believed they were superior to black people, and that's why they were keeping them separate. That the purpose of these separate cars, right? Keep it separate facilities, separate accommodations between blacks and whites, was not to keep white people out of black facilities, because whites were free to intrude. They went into black facilities. An example is the anti-miscegenation laws that existed, right? Remember, there was a law against the mixing of the races. Even though it was illegal for black and white to marry in the South because they had the anti-miscegenation laws, right? The people who violated that law could be imprisoned and enslaved. Initially, enslavement was a punishment, but they removed that because they didn't want to enslave white people anymore. In the beginning of America, remember, in the 17th century, early 17th century, there were whites who were enslaved as well. They were indentured servants, right? But indentured servitude was not permanent, right? It was until later on that slavery became permanent and inheritable, right? Heritable, that it passed on from mother to her children. So if you consider Justice John Marshall Harlan's argument, saying that, look, the purpose of these segregation laws is not to keep white people away from black people's facilities or their persons. It's actually to keep black people out of white people's facilities and persons. So you can see that in the anti-miscegenation laws, for instance, despite the fact that it was a severe crime for blacks and whites to intermarry. We see white men routinely, violated the persons, went into the premises of their female black slaves. They had children by their female black slaves. We know the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, right? So the white people were free to enter the premises and facilities of these of black people to violate their persons, right? But black men could not do the reverse. Black men could not go into the white woman's facilities. They could not violate their. So they could not violate their person or their facilities. They couldn't do the reverse. So it showed that the white person was superior to the black person, right? And Justice John Marshall Harlan, from his family experience, he understood. Again, he came from a slave-holding family in Kentucky, and he actually had a half brother who was a slave, a half older brother who was a slave. His name was Robert Harlan. I talked about him in the earlier video. Robert Harlan had been, um, born to Justice John Marshall Harlan's slaveholding father. He's Justice John Marshall Harlan's father had been a politician in Kentucky. He was Secretary of State, and he had a son by his female slave named Robert Harlan. So even though legally, because of the laws, he was a slave, but the father raised him in his household with his white brothers. So this guy Robert Harlan was raised with the white brothers. The father had tried to enroll him in school, but when the in Ohio, in another state, but when the officials found that, well, that the guy was really, was black, they kicked him out, so he couldn't attend school. But Robert Harlan learned to read, learned to write, learned to study from reading the books of his brothers. So fortunately, Robert Harlan, even though he was a slave, he was, son of a slave, was black, was mixed. It was, again, uh, remember in America they use hypo descent, just as we call President Barack Obama black, even though he's half white, half black. I'm just going to be referring to him as black, even though he's the half brother of a white man, Justice John Marshall Harlan. So Robert Harlan was black, and he learned to read, to write from associating with his white brothers, because their father, right, encouraged it. He raised him within the household with his brothers, with his white brothers. Eventually, their father set him free, went to file legal papers, and set him free. Made him a free man, and then he made his way during the California Gold Rush of 1849. That's Robert Harlan, the half brother of Justice John Marshall Harlan, and he struck gold. He became wealthy, right? He amassed $50,000 in the California Gold Rush. That is the equivalent of, in 1859, it was $50,000. That was a lot. It's the equivalent in today's money. It's equivalent to over $2 million. So he became very wealthy. He became so wealthy, and because he was very close to his white brothers, they treated him well. They treated him like a brother, even though the law, did not recognize him. So when he was wealthy, he actually supported his white brothers financially. That's Robert Harlan, the black slave. He went on to uh, become a politician himself. In fact, he became a good friend of President Ulysses Grant, because I'd done earlier videos when I talked about Ulysses Grant loved horses. He was an expert in horse riding. That was the one thing he did very well at West Point, because his father had bought him a horse, a pony, since the time he was very young, right? Remember, Ulysses Grant's father was actually a wealthy man. He was a self-made man. He wasn't educated. He was a self-made man. It was through his connections that Ulysses Grant got into West Point. He got it through his connections. He knew a senator, and he got his son Ulysses Grant into West Point. And Ulysses Grant loved horses since he was a child. So Robert Harlan, that's the half brother, the black half brother of Justice John Marshall Harlan. Robert Harlan, he he got his money, the money he got from the gold rush. He invested some in the securities market, and he was earning a revenue of $7,000 a year. But he also started to import horse races. Uh, he moved to England and started to import horse races, right? And got into betting on horse racing. So he was very into horses, and so him and President Ulysses Grant. They developed a friendship. They were friends, and he won a patronage job as an inspector in the U.S. Treasury. He also went on into politics. He was a member of the Ohio House of Representatives, and he was an activist in Black civil rights. That's Robert Harlan. So you could see how Justice John Marshall Harlan he knew the experience of his family, right? He knew what look, when you keep blacks and whites separate, because his brother was not allowed to attend school. And the father had tried to enroll him in a school in Ohio, but he was kicked out because he was black. It wasn't, it was the reason why they segregated blacks and whites was because whites felt superior to black people. So he understood from experience, and he stated this, and he talked about something. There was something he said though that some people, you would find racist. So, but you could see he had a bias towards for black people. I guess because he had a black brother. He wrote something, sort of disparaging of Chinese people. He said, "Look, in his dissent, he said there's a race of people that Americans are very different from," and that was that was the basis for the racism of against the Chinese and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And he stated that Chinese people are not even allowed to become citizens of America. And he praised, and then he said, but even though Chinese people are so different from Americans, they cannot be part of Americans. And this is not true. This is not my views, but this is what Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote. So it's kind of like a paradox, right? He seems to be uh, uh, in one vein, he's espousing all uh, the 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 virtues and the virtues of equality of the races, but here he is at the same time he's disparaging a race, saying, well, the Chinese people are very different from Americans. They cannot be Americans. That they have in their laws that they can never be citizens, right? Except in a very few exceptions. This is what he's saying in his dissent. But he's saying that, but Chinese men are allowed to ride in the same car on a train with white people, right? So he was saying that, look, but why is it that black people? This was what he raised. The question he raised, that black people though who fought. He said they fought in the Civil War to preserve the Union, and that's the case. About 40,000 black men died in the Civil War. They fought on the side of the Union. So he said they fought in the Civil War, but they are criminalized. They're viewed as criminals if they are found riding in the same car as white people, right? So this he found to be perplexing, and he said it was troubling, that even though blacks actually were citizens and that Chinese people weren't citizens, they couldn't be allowed to be citizens. That was at that time because there was the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, right? So he said that, well, that blacks were citizens by virtue of the 14th Amendment. They were citizens of the United States, but Chinese people were not even allowed to be citizens because of the Chinese Exclusion Act, except in rare exceptions, as he put it. Um, and blacks, were deemed criminals if they rode on the same uh, in the same car, in the same coach as white people. Meanwhile, Chinese, whom he said were different and were barred by an act, that's the Chinese Exclusion Act, from becoming citizens, he said they were allowed to ride on the same car with white people, even though at that time he claimed they didn't have the same citizenship rights, civil rights as black people. Something else he said as well, which you can view as an oxymoron. He said, well, that the U.S. laws, while he said that, yes, that the U.S. laws did not recognize distinctions of class, it didn't recognize class, right? And it was colorblind. He also said something, like I said, you can consider it an oxymoron. He said um, that the humblest man, right, the humblest black person, the humblest man he said the Constitution is colorblind. So he said the humblest man is a peer of the most powerful man. So that was what he said. You can see that's an oxymoron. So you can see those are uh, his idealist aspirations, his idealist views. And you can see why he wrote that, because that was the age of the Gilded Age, right? The Gilded Age was when they had these billionaires, the Andrew Carnegies, the J.P. Morgans, the Vanderbilts, and these people had unbridled, money that was extreme, while the poor people were really suffering. The laborers, they didn't even have safety protections in the factories in America at that time. But the America was now starting to mint its first billionaires, right, who lived like royalty in New York, including our Andrew Carnegie, who was said to be the richest man in the world at that time. And he came as an immigrant with nothing. So so you can see why it's sort of like a blowback in his person, in his views, right, in his ideals, and when he's saying, and it's sort of an oxymoron, like I said, when he says the humblest man in the Constitution, in the way the Constitution is codified, the humblest man is a peer of the most powerful man, right? But is that the case? Was that true? Right? That was not the case. Can even till today, and we're seeing what's going on. Is that really the case, that even though the Constitution does not respect class, because this was what John Marshall Harlan was saying. He was saying that the Constitution does not recognize class distinctions, and it's colorblind. And he was arguing that the humblest man is a peer of the most powerful man. Well, when we consider the paraphernalia that comes with being the most powerful man, all the bodyguards, all the limos, and all the whatever, and the humblest man who's stripped of everything, even dignity, is that really the case in practice? Well, that's not the case in practice, but we can see the aspirational views of Justice Marshall Harlan, and he was, identifying with the aspirational views of the founding fathers as well. Um, so, so something else he said was, he said we'd reached an era of constitutional law in which the American citizen that had previously, is no longer protected. There's no protection for the American citizen. Although before, during the era of slavery, the nation protected the slave owner and slavery. This is what he's saying, that look, that the federal government, the nation, the laws, the government protected the slave owner and the institution of slavery. And he's saying that, well, we've now made Black American citizens, but the court is now stripping them of protections by leaving them at the mercy of the South to establish these racist laws, because Jim Crow, the segregation laws are saying, well, separate is equal. And we will see that the uh, the parallel system that was created. So they were saying, well, it's equal so long as, well, if you have facilities, if you're going to have cars, right, have a coach for, if you're going to have a railroad line, have one for black, one for whites, then it's equal. The reality is, when they created these double systems, parallel systems, if they created a school, create one for black kids, create one for white kids, the facilities that were created for blacks were invariably inferior. They were low quality. And this was what we saw. And this was why Brown versus Board of Education overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, because Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP team were able to show that, well, that the facilities that were given to black people were inferior. And in fact, they weren't just inferior, it actually ended up making black kids themselves feel inferior. Brown versus Board of Education dealt with, it desegregated schools, public schools, right? That was where it started, desegregated public schools. And so, and there was the fallout from Plessy versus Ferguson was also in the manifestations of violent acts against black people. Because one, the South also now the southern states now amended those constitutions they were forced to draft during Reconstruction. Remember, I mentioned how the Reconstruction Acts created military districts, and the military now, the federal government, federal troops, forced um, the southern states to create new constitutions that protected, recognized the citizenship of Black Americans, ratified the 14th Amendment, and made them equal, created laws protecting them. So, what the South did with Plessy versus Ferguson was they now created new constitutions and created a Jim Crow system, created laws subordinating Black people, and those laws that would end up criminalizing Black people. So, with de jure segregation, de jure subordination of in the South, they made de jure it made blacks de jure second class citizens, subordinate to white people. That was what Plessy versus Ferguson ended up doing in the South, and it allowed it was a catalyst that led to the mass lynching of black people in the 1900s. It saw the early 1900s saw the highest, the peak of lynchings against black people, black men in the South. Between 1883 and 1941, it is estimated that over 3,200 black Americans were lynched in the South. Right. So, and this was a fallout. This was the fallout of Plessy versus Ferguson. So it was a horrible law. It sanctioned uh, racist mob action against black people. We see it even blacks initially were creating wealth, they were prospering, and we see it in there was often mass action, by state officials, racist state officials in the South, like the Tulsa race riots, Tulsa race massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when whites raided what was used to be called uh, Black Wall Street in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and they burned it to the ground. It was razed. That area, Greenwood district, was known as Black Wall Street. It was one of the uh, richest black communities in America. And so the Plessy versus Ferguson, it can't be understated how it sanctioned racist white violence against black people. I want to stop this video here. Still have more to say about these laws, and I will continue in a subsequent video. Um, so, in any event, my name is Osha. Again, this is in honor of Black History Month, and I'll keep you posted. Thank you.